Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 49 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening! Huddled atop her mare like a bird on a branch, Janir pulled the cowl of her cloak further over her head and hoped her numb fingers held the reins. She had been worried about avalanches. Her concern was unnecessary, at least for now. A cruel wind clawed at her face and penetrated even the thickest of clothes. In front of her, her mare's sorrel mane tossed and flapped, while whirling snowflakes danced around their heads. The column of riders snaked away in front and behind. They rode double file, as many as could ride on the narrow mountain road abreast. Beside her was Canicade's hunched-over form, astride his steed. They traveled steadily upwards, pressing farther and farther into the heart of the mountains. The only respite any of them received was at night by the fire, or when they would shovel hot coals into shallow tracks, cover them in sand, and then set up their bedrolls on top. Amilla, Canicade, and Cerilius had graciously allowed Janir to learn the hard way that it was important to put enough dirt down. The first night, they let Janir cover the coals in sand herself, and all laughed when Janir leapt up yelping after a short while. But aside from occasional harmless pranks, they guarded her with the utmost attentiveness, and made sure she was kept away from the other Argetallams. There was no way of telling who might have had a hand in the assassination attempt. Canistra found the opportunity to check on Janir once or twice, but she usually kept her distance, not wanting to rouse any unnecessary suspicions. Janir found she preferred it that way, though she wished Lucan would at least speak to her. It was hard to know what the others thought of her, though Janir noted pointed stares and whispered conversations that hushed when she came in earshot. No one openly questioned who she was, nor gave any hint to show they recognized her. Janir wondered at that, but it was one of the less pressing matters on her mind. A faint shrieking grew louder over the whooshing of the wind. Janir glanced around through the roiling abyss of white around her, but nobody else seemed alarmed. A short distance ahead, the litter bearing the chalice bobbed between the two mules. Somewhere in the lead of the column was the Lord Argetallam, though Janir couldn't see exactly where. Before she realized it, the air had cleared of snowflakes, and sheer rock walls had sprung up on either side of them. Janir tilted her head back to see the strip of gray sky visible at the narrow top of the gorge. She guessed that the shrieking must be the wind blowing through the cragged rocks. Janir's mare shook her mane free of the white specks and snorted as they marched out of the wind into the protected gorge. The cold still reverberated from the air, but at least there was no longer a clawing wind. After a while, Janir was even able to feel her fingers again. The clopping of some 250 horses echoed as they marched onwards. The road, or whatever it was, never showed any signs of widening. Several times, Janir caught herself imagining that the rugged walls of the gorge were moving together to crush them. She couldn't tell exactly how long they traveled through the narrow pass, though she guessed it was somewhere around an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. A shout came from a bend in the gorge up ahead, and the column abruptly halted. She heard voices, but nothing intelligible, and she couldn't see around the curve in the gorge. She glanced to Canicade, alarmed. "I'm guessing we just bumped into some slavish sentries," he speculated, offering a reassuring grin. In moments, they were on the move again. When Janir's mount rounded the bend, she saw rock lookouts carved directly into the stone with about 20 slavish sentries in all, bundled up so tightly that only their eyes showed, perched above the riders below. A quarter of an hour later, they were stopped by another sentry lookout, and then they moved on. Barely 5 minutes after that, the city gates came into view. The road widened, and Janir received her first impression of what Valmochan had been like over 100 years before. A massive arch of pinkish-tan stone, carved with the faces of wild beasts, and images of armored warriors spanned the gorge. The actual gate had been made of wood and had rotted away, leaving behind heavy steel hinges on either side of the entrance. A few slavish sentries were posted by the gate, but they didn't stop the Argetallams. Instead, they waved them through, eyeing the casket borne on the litter and murmuring amongst themselves. They may not have known exactly what was inside it, but they must have heard rumors. As Janir passed through the city gate, the sight made her stare. The city of Valmochan had been built in a small valley, perhaps 2 miles across at its widest point. The streets below the buildings weren't cobblestoned, but instead were earth, packed hard after years of men and beasts treading them over and over. In the center of the city was the vast and once famed marketplace, huge mansions, a colossal amphitheater, and also the smaller houses that had once belonged to the more humble. Most remarkable were the buildings that had been constructed on the edge of the city. Palaces, crypts, temples, and cathedrals with columns and statues by the front entrances, sculpted directly into the faces of the mountains. Men of the Slavish army ran through drills in the courtyard of the great mansions, sat around cook fires telling obscene jokes, sharpened their weapons on the front steps of a palace. Still Valmochan was eerily empty and hollow. Though the Slavish army had turned the mansions into barracks, the temples into storerooms, and the amphitheater into a training ground, the city still felt devoid of the living. The bodies and bones of Valmochan's citizens had been lost to the elements and the wild animals many years before, but Janir still felt like she was trespassing. She shook her head, thinking it was her imagination. Whether or not it was her imagination or something more. For as long as she drew breath, she never did shake the feeling that Valmochan belonged to the dead, and the living had no place there. Guided by a sentry with orders to lead them to the Slavish commanders, the Argetallams marched through Valmochan's streets to what had once been a palace. Slavish guards rimmed outside walls. The building's front steps led up into a grand entrance with carved scrollwork on the pillars. Lifelike sculptures of now-forgotten people watched either side of the steps. The Lord Argetallam gave the order for the Argetallams to dismount. Janir groaned. She hated getting out of the saddle after she'd been in it all day. She was always more sore than she had thought she would be. Her father called for the chest to be taken off the litter, and within moments 4 Argetallam Mortons were supporting it between them. Janir frowned, the flare of enchantment burning strong from inside the mansion. Bits of stray magic lay about, as with the rest of the city, but there was a source within. She looked to Cerilius, wanting to ask, but a man in a blue tunic jogged down the front steps to meet them, and she stayed silent. They were too far back in the column to hear what words passed between the man and her father, but the man in blue stooped at the waist before he motioned for the Lord Argetallam to follow him. 15 of the honor guard with me. Prince Lucan, see that the warriors tend their horses, and then get to our barracks for some rest, the Lord Argetallam commanded. Crown honor guard, with me. Lucan blinked. He had been riding just behind their father, more obviously part of the royal family. My lord? Canistrith looked quickly between Lucan and the Lord Argetallam. Her shoulders rose as if she had just taken a breath, but she stopped herself short. Is there a problem? The Lord Argetallam's face was deadpan. No, my lord. Lucan recovered himself quickly. Forgive me, my lord. Carry on. The Lord Argetallam turned away. Lucan took the lead of the Argetallam column, calling the warriors to attention with Canistrith directly behind him. Hey, Crown Honor Guard. That's us. Kanake discreetly elbowed Janir in the ribs. I'm guessing he wants to give you some diplomatic experience. Oh, yes. Janir handed the reins of her mare to another Argetallum and fell into step beside Canicade, with Amilla and Cerilius behind. They marched through the grand foyer and broad hallway, both styling ornate ceiling murals of colored glass, and yet completely lacking the lavish and luxurious furniture one would expect to find below such artwork. They marched into a sizable room without any windows, and a blazing hearth on the far side. Janir ached to rush forward and hold her hands out to the fire's heat, but that certainly wasn't what an Argetallum royal should do. In the middle of the room was a round oak table with maps, scrolls, letters, and unused sealing wax lying pell-mell atop it. Aside from 2 rickety-looking wooden chairs near the fireplace and a functional rug, the table was the only furniture. The source of magic Janir had sensed outside was close, incredibly close. The 4 men carrying the casket set it down with a dull thud. The man in blue who had guided them here bowed once more and then backed against the wall where he stood with 2 other men who looked like noblemen. "Lord Argetallum, you join us at last," greeted a Slavish man with a salt and pepper beard. The Slavish man rested his knuckles on the table as he leaned over a map of the ivy-down province of Brevia. "You disapprove of my timing, Lord von Mar?" the Lord Argetallum casually inquired. "The pleasure of your company is so very delightful. Who wouldn't wish you here sooner?" Janir turned her head to the second speaker, a Brevian woman with long, wavy auburn tresses, partly concealed in the shadows. The woman stepped forward with the slight swishing of velvet as her scarlet dress shimmered in the firelight. Magic fairly emanated from inside her. There was no mistaking it. An enchantress. Trailing next to the woman was the ugliest creature Janir had ever seen. It was knee-high and moss-green, with long, lanky limbs attached to a round, cylindrical body. The creature had a long, pointed face with 2 protruding front teeth, and trembling whiskers on either side of a quivering nose. Its excessive ears flapped with its every step, and its beady black eyes darted around the room with complete randomness, not focused on anything in particular, seeming to absorb arbitrary details. A stained leather jerkin covered the creature's slimy green body. The creature stopped when the woman did, to stare up at her, like a lapdog awaiting his mistress's next behest. "I shall ignore your condescension this once, woman, provided you deliver on your promises," the Lord Argetallum coolly retorted. "Is that the chalice?" Strahl inquired, gesturing to the chest, his face straight but an edge of anxiety in his voice. "Indeed," the Lord Argetallum replied, motioning the casket forward. The 4 Argetallums set the chest on the table with a solid thump, and one of them pulled a ring of keys from his belt to unfasten the heavy padlock. The lock came away with a dull click, and then the Argetallum Morton undid the remaining clasps to the chest lid. Creaking faintly, the lid swung open. The woman in scarlet stepped up to the casket and reached inside, the hideous green thing following close beside her. After moving the cloth used to keep the contents secure, the woman reverently raised the chalice, and Janir stared, fascinated. The chalice was made of silver that had been very well preserved over the centuries. The bowl of the chalice was adorned with scenes that were hard to make out in the unsteady firelight. A bronze cover, held down by firm clasps, had been added to the chalice at some point in the past millennia to protect the precious blood contained inside, and the stem was knotted with what appeared to be copper wire. If the enchantress could sense the inferno of power inside, she was unafraid. If anything, she seemed excited. A mischievous grin spread across her full mouth. "Zamarza," the Lord Argetallum drawled, in a cautionary tone. "Oh, I'm not going to run off with it," the woman in scarlet, Zamarza, retorted. "I'll admit it occurred to me. But how would I get everything I wanted if I did?" The woman gingerly laid the chalice back in its place. "How long before my men are spelled?" Strahl was certainly in no humor for small talk. "Well, I will have to cite the incantations first, of course. Then I should probably test the spell so that if I have any trouble, that can be remedied. I should probably also practice removing the spell. Zamarza trailed off, looking contemplative. The woman was antagonizing Strahl on purpose and reveling in every moment. Janir had no doubt. How long? Strahl pressed, an edge of anger in his voice. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Strahl fumed. No country was made in a day, nor are countries conquered in a day, Zamarza coolly retorted. Be patient, man. I should have let the spellcasters of the Enchanter Temple in Sentirith sort this out, Strahl grumbled. Then you would have had to wait 2 years, Zamarza replied with a sultry smile. Your little enchanter monks and enchantress nuns are no match for the likes of me. Where do you want the chalice? The Lord Argetallum interrupted. Why, what a gentleman, Zamarza murmured. A mischievous glint entered her eye as she proceeded to survey the Lord Argetallum from head to foot. Janir restrained an impulse to gag. What do you think, Cribbs? Zamarza glanced sideways to the revolting creature at her feet. Cribb's voice was just what Janir imagined a rat would sound like if it spent too much time breathing smoke. I think the room we chose earlier is perfect, mistress, Cribbs squeaked. What a helpful little goblin you are. This way, if you please. Zamarza motioned to the Argetallams and swept out of the council chamber, or whatever the room was, with a graceful stride and the swoosh of velvet, her faithful pet at her heels. The Lord Argetallum motioned for the Argetallams carrying the chest to follow her. Once the enchantress was presumably out of earshot, Strahl heaved a sigh. I despise that woman from the bottom of my heart, he grumbled. The Lord Argetallum made no comment. I trust your journey was uneventful, old friend. Strahl straightened, flexing his hands as if he had rheumatism. It was. The Lord Argetallum set to loosening his gloves as the general gestured for 2 wine glasses. Your sultan has changed his mind, I trust. Strahl let a short breath out his nose. The old man argued against this campaign until the very end. There were even a few moments I feared some of the nobles might listen. Janir fought the urge to fold her arms across her chest as an icy draft slithered against her legs. She needed to at least appear Argetallum. My father is old, tired, Strahl said. He is not the warrior he once was. He may soon find the peace he seeks. The Lord Argetallum accepted a goblet from the general, and they toasted before drinking. But I have no doubt you will bring honor to his legacy. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.